All right, let's get right into it. You've seen the headlines, but underneath all of that, a really serious legal question has started to bubble up. And it's one that goes way beyond the daily news cycle and deep into the core principles of international law. Today, we're going to break down the legal arguments surrounding U.S. complicity in alleged war crimes. Basically, we're looking at how a case like this would even be constructed. And this quote, it really gets to the heart of it. This is the central question that legal scholars and analysts are wrestling with. So, just to be clear, our goal here isn't to take a side or to act like a judge and jury. Not at all. It's to understand the legal framework itself. So, let's put on our analyst hats and see how international law gets applied to one of the most complex geopolitical issues of our time.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll define what complicity even means in this context. Then we'll get into the weeds of the two-part legal test that any case would have to pass. From there, we'll look at the evidence cited for both parts of that test, check out the official counterarguments, and then wrap up with the big fundamental question that's driving this entire debate.
Okay, first things first. Before you can even talk about complicity, you have to establish something else. The entire legal case for being an accomplice hinges on whether a primary internationally wrongful act, like a war crime, was committed in the first place. See, for a state to be considered an accomplice, another state must have allegedly committed one of these primary offenses. And in this situation, international bodies like the UN have pointed to these specific alleged crimes under international humanitarian law. These acts form the foundation, the predicate, on which any argument for complicity has to be built. All right, now let's talk about the law itself. Under international law, complicity, or aiding and abetting, as it's often called, isn't about actually pulling the trigger. It's about knowingly providing the gun. It's a legal concept designed to hold countries accountable, not just for what they do, but for their role in enabling what others do. To make this super simple, just think about a getaway driver. The law doesn't just go after the person who ran into the bank. It also holds the driver responsible, but only if they knew what was going on and their actions actually helped make the crime happen. That's the core idea of aiding and abetting. Now, proving this in a court of law breaks down into a two-part test. The first part is the physical act, or what lawyers call actus reus. This is the material element. The question here is pretty straightforward. Did one state provide aid, we're talking weapons, funding, that sort of thing, that had a substantial effect on another state's ability to commit the alleged crime? And the second part is the mental element, or mens rea. This is all about knowledge. Now, this is crucial. The assisting state doesn't need to want the crimes to happen. It just has to be aware of a substantial likelihood that its help will be used to commit them. It's about knowing the circumstances, not sharing the same criminal goal. So to build a case, you absolutely need both. You need the actus reus, the proof of significant physical help, and you need the mens rea, the proof that this help was given with full knowledge of how it was probably going to be used. So how would a prosecutor even begin to build this case? Well, they'd start with that first part of the test, actus reus. What's the evidence that U.S. assistance had a substantial effect on military operations in Gaza? The argument usually kicks off with just the sheer scale of the support. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, U.S. spending tied to Israel's military operations in the year after October 7th was nearly $23 billion. That is a massive number, way more than in any single prior year, and it's the first pillar in the argument that the assistance was, in legal terms, significant. And the argument gets really specific here. It's not just about the money, it's about the actual means that were provided. The case would point to things like the transfer of thousands of huge bombs, like the 2,000-pound Mk-84, and tens of thousands of artillery shells. The argument is that these are the very tools used in attacks on dense urban areas that have raised red flags under international law. But the case for the act doesn't just stop at weapons. Proponents also bring up things like diplomatic shielding, like vetoing ceasefire resolutions at the UN Security Council, as well as intelligence sharing and political pushback against international courts. The claim is that all of these things together created an environment where military operations could just keep going. And that brings us to the second, and you could argue the trickier part of the legal test, mens rea, the mental element. The question isn't just, did the U.S. help, but did the U.S. know? So how is the case for knowledge actually put together? The core of the argument for mens rea often looks something like this timeline. It places public warnings and official legal findings right next to the continued approval of arms transfers.
The legal argument being made is that the aid kept flowing after high-level officials and international courts had already raised major alarms, which suggests a conscious choice was made to provide help despite knowing the risks.
And this quote right here is a bombshell. It's from the U.S. State Department's own report to Congress. In a legal argument, this would be presented as a formal admission from inside the U.S. government that it had credible information suggesting its weapons had likely been used in violation of international law. And finally, the case for knowledge is supported by physical evidence. Human rights organizations have done investigations claiming to have found fragments of specific U.S.-made munitions at the sites of specific attacks on civilian areas. This kind of evidence is used to draw a direct line from the assistance that was provided to the alleged wrongful acts on the ground. Of course, any good legal analysis has to look at both sides of the coin. So how does the U.S. government push back against these claims? Let's break down the official position and the legal defenses that would likely be used to fight an accusation of complicity. The official U.S. stance is really built on three main ideas. First, that all the aid is for supporting Israel's inherent right to self-defense. Second, that U.S. officials are constantly in talks, pushing for compliance with international law. And third, that American influence is actually being used to reduce civilian harm, not to enable it. So the core legal defense would probably have three parts. First, an argument about intent, saying the purpose of the aid was for self-defense, not to help commit crimes. Second, they would emphasize that the U.S. has no operational control over how Israel's military conducts its operations. And third, and this is a huge one, they would challenge the very jurisdiction of the international courts themselves, basically saying they have no authority in this matter.
And that last point is so important. A central part of the U.S. counterargument is to change the subject of the debate. Instead of arguing about the facts of what happened, the strategy often pivots to delegitimizing the legal forums where those facts would be judged, arguing that national sovereignty is more important than the authority of these international bodies.
So, we've looked at the law, we've looked at the evidence used to build the case for complicity, and we've looked at the official defense. And this brings us to the fundamental tension that sits right at the heart of this entire issue.
It all boils down to this core conflict. On one side, you've got the duties that come with international law, the obligation to not aid or abet war crimes. And on the other side, you have the strategic realities of foreign policy and a nation's sovereign right to support its allies. This case brings that clash into incredibly sharp focus.
At the end of the day, while a formal court might never reach a verdict here, the very act of building the legal argument forces us all to confront this question. It's a question that really challenges the entire international legal system and asks us all to think about what responsibility means in a world of powerful alliances. And that is a question with no easy answer.